Oh,
There it is.
hi, welcome. This is session IC52, Best Practices in Online Seating and Mobility Education. I will be moderating today's session and I'll provide the CEU code at the end. Before we get started, please remember to mute yourself. Questions can be asked in the chat feature, and I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off. So as I said, today's presentation is Best Practices in Online Seating and Mobility Education.
And my name's Tina Roesler. I'm going to start by introducing myself and Carmen DiGiovine. He can't be with us today. I currently work for BodyPoint as the Director of Clinical and Business Development. I've been in the industry about 25 years, and I think that this presentation is very timely. And it was actually Carmen's brainchild over a year before the pandemic began. So I think the recent events of the last 2 years have really put more of an emphasis on it. Dr. Carmen DiGiovine can't be with us today. He had some family things he had to take care of. He's from the Ohio State University and Wexner Medical Center, and he really was the spearhead behind this presentation. So we're sorry he can't be with us, but you will see him and hear him.
I'm Theresa Berner. I get the luxury of working with Carmen at the Ohio State University Medical Center. He's more on the academic side and spends some time in the clinic. I'm mainly in the clinic side and spend some time in academic. So I'll share with you how I have worked with online seating and mobility education.
And I'm Kieschnik. I've been in the industry over 40 years, certified, as I like to say, back in the late 1900s, and been working in pediatrics, transitioned over for direct hands-on service to more of the education and training as our field force was aging. And I started talking with Carmen as we realized we had to go to some way to reach out our new candidates in a better manner. So we were excited about this when we first started. It was a much different time. So I think we're both all interested in sharing the changes and the things we found out with you today.
So just to disclose any conflicts of interest, we just want to state who we work for, and that Anne works for a supplier and I work for a manufacturer, and that both Theresa and Carmen have certain grants that they've received funding from. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about the learning objectives. We want to define online education because it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. We're going to talk about the opportunities and barriers, and we're going to give some very concrete examples as to what we've experienced just even over the last 2 years or longer. Carmen's really going to talk about how to translate that into in-person learning outcomes and change them to online learning outcomes, because as my team that I was running realized that it's very different, and it's more different than you expect. And then how do we apply these online education principles to seating mobility education in that student's own context? And how have we all done that in different ways? So we're going to really talk about best practices, and then we're going to give you the perspective of all three of us. Theresa will cover the clinical perspective, Anne will talk about the supplier perspective, and I'll talk about the manufacturer perspective, and then we will open it up for questions in the end. Anytime you have a question, you can enter it in the chat, and then we'll get to it all as we finish the presentation. Now, the exciting thing is that Carmen couldn't be with us, so in true online education format, we're going to go ahead and Carmen is going to actually present his asynchronously via video. So make sure your volume is turned up.
And so now I'm going to jump in here, do a little bit of asynchronous teaching, and talk a little bit about the foundations of online education. So in terms of the foundations of online education, there's 5 key areas that I'm going to talk about today, and 5 questions I'm going to hopefully briefly answer. First is, what is online education? Second, what are the reasons for online education prior to COVID? Remember that my experience with online education started before COVID, but has been amplified because of it. What is the
I can't hear him. Can you guys hear? Okay. So Tina, it looks like a lot of people cannot hear his sound.
Lately, we keep hearing about this thing called.
It's
MEP.
back. Can you hear it now?
Well, we're not quite sure about which terms are the best terms, but for today's presentation, I'm going to use the term online education. So just want to level set on some definitions. If you're new to online education, it'll give you a sense of what terminology you should be using when talking to other people, and when you're trying to learn about it and you're reading about it, what terminology you might see. So the first thing is, what is an online course? Well, it's delivered completely on the internet. The second thing is a hybrid or blended course. And this is taking a combination of a traditional course and an online course and mashing them together. Now, this is where it gets a little confusing, because when you talk about traditional courses, sometimes people are talking about face-to-face courses, in person, and face-to-face courses online in a hybrid setting. So it gets a little tricky here, but the thing we're going to focus on, of course, is online courses. And then the last two terms I just want to bring up are asynchronous and synchronous. You've heard me talk about asynchronous. That's what I'm doing right now, where the teaching and learning, hopefully there's learning going on. The teaching and learning is happening at different times. And synchronous is where teaching and learning is happening at the same time. It's the traditional webinars that we've been used to for the past decade now. Oftentimes I get asked, what are the reasons for online education besides, hey, it's cool? And you know me, I love technology, so I'm always trying to bring technology into the classroom. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But what are the reasons for online education? It's important to know this so that you can talk to other people in the field of why you're using online education as a modality, that you're not just doing it because you have to. And the first one that came out of Moore and Kersley is an increased access to learning and training as a matter of equity and inclusion. And that's extremely important. It's always been extremely important, but we're becoming more aware of it today. Provide opportunities for updating skills, improve the cost effectiveness. It is less expensive to travel than traveling to a location and doing a face-to-face course. Improve the quality of existing educational structures and enhance the capacity of the educational system. I just want to talk quickly about improving the quality of existing educational structures. I've taken the things that I've learned in the online environment and brought it into the in-person environment, my face-to-face courses, to make those courses better. Some more reasons for online education. The list just goes on and on. Delivering educational campaigns to specific target audiences. That could be specific to assistive technology professionals. Provide emergency training as we're transitioning and shifting in our current environment. Emergency training or on-the-spot training is so important. Expand the capacity for education, allows us to broaden our audience. Offer combination of education with work and family. This is great because it allows us to meet the learner where they are in terms of their work life, their home life, and their educational goals. And then this one's been really interesting for me professionally, add an international dimension. I've been able to bring international components into my classroom, and I've also been able to get to an international audience of students. So we oftentimes talk about technology. Oftentimes people want to focus on it. We're in the assistive technology field. So oftentimes we feel like, hey, that's cool technology, let's use it. But you have to have a reason for using it, and you have to know what that reason is in order to meet the students' goals or to meet the course goals and the course objectives. So don't just use technology for technology's sake. So some of the things that technology can do for you, it can enable frequent low-stakes testing. Testing is actually what we call a formative way of education. We do formative testing, meaning we do testing at the beginning to kind of get that metacognition going, get that the brain pump, if you will, primed and ready for what you're going to talk about or what you're going to go over in the learning activities. It encourages better spacing of study over the time. So you can, rather than just giving the student all the material, you can ask them to go through the material over a certain number of weeks and structure it or scaffold it so that they only get certain material at each week. And that helps them in the learning process. Gets away from that idea that you can just cram when you're in an online environment. take advantage of learners' existing knowledge. We can bring what the students know and their experiences into the classroom. And I do that all the time through discussion posts. And then presentation of material via multiple sensory modalities. And I'm doing that right now. I'm talking to you. There's a little bit of visual. We can bring in a tactile component. And then we can do it in different ways using video and audio and text. And Miller does a great job of continuing this idea of what is the role of technology, and provides 4 more ideas. Capturing and holding students' attention. I'm going to try to keep my video to less than 10 minutes, because we find if it's any longer than 10 minutes, we start losing people. So it allows you to break up the videos that you may be creating into little snippets so that you can focus on one thing and keep the students' attention. Supports frequent and varied practice. Connects with the students socially and fires them up emotionally. If I can bring in, if the students can bring stuff in that they see or find on the internet or in social media into the classroom, it really amplifies the effect of the learning activities and allows it and makes it easier to reach the course objectives. And then finally, we can borrow from the techniques of the gaming industry. I haven't done that a lot, but that's definitely one thing we can do. So I want you to leave today. We've gone over these definitions and we've gone over this background, but I want you to leave today saying, hey, I can do one thing. I can do one thing in my own courses, or I can do one thing in my own workshops, or I can do one thing as I build a new workshop if you're a novice in the field of online education. And so there's this great book by Darby and Lang called Small Teaching Online, and I'm pulling directly from it. And they have great ideas of how you can do it, how you can do this. And some of the things to keep in mind that I've already been talking about are brief teaching and learning activities. So using brief teaching and learning activities. If you're going to make a design modification to your course, make sure that it's small and make sure you can track, did it work or didn't it work? And reach out to the students for feedback. They're always willing to give you feedback. And speaking of feedback, you always have to focus on communication in an online environment. It's not easy to do. I'm not sure right now how well this communication, it's one-way communication, is working. So I have no sense of your feedback. So you have to come up with ways to get feedback from the students. That may be polls that you put into the course, into the online course, or into the videos. It could be discussion posts, or it could be quizzes. You can use quizzes to get feedback. But it has to be 2 ways. You can't just push stuff out, and the learners can't just do assignments and you not give them feedback on how they're doing or how it went. So it's that feedback mechanism that really engages the student and really lets you know that the student is meeting the learning outcomes. So that's it for today. For my part, I'm going to now turn it back over to Tina, Theresa, and Ann to talk about specific applications of online education. Thanks.
So I think for all of us, Carmen's introduction was really good and kind of explains it in more detail and how the differences are. But now we want to give you some practical examples of how we're shifting to online education, some of the unique challenges that I think when the 4 of us spoke about this, that we've all faced, especially in the last 2 years, with having to do it quickly and not necessarily in always the best way because it had to be so quick. I know from my perspective and Ann's perspective, and even Theresa's and Carmen's, was how do you continue current programs when you have to make an abrupt shift from, say, only in person to something that's either a hybrid or all online? From my point of view and Ann's point of view, tracking participation and success was going to become a real challenge because there are certain requirements for tracking, for example, CEU programs or people's testing that we were doing with paper and pen and Excel spreadsheets. And now how do we make that more easily done and efficient? Big question for us was, do we have an adequate learning management system? An LMS wasn't a word that most of us talked about. We had to decide what kind of program do we want to use? How does it integrate into our systems, or does it integrate to our systems? And what one is going to meet our needs the best? So I'm sure all of us have used different systems for different applications. Just like today we're using Zoom. I've used Teams, we've used GoToWebinar, we've used other learning management systems. OSU, I'm sure, has proprietary systems that they're using to do their online education. And then again, how do we measure the effectiveness? Like Carmen said, it's kind of a one-way feedback loop, or it seems it is, and we have to find a way to get the information from the participants and get their feedback and understand how things are going. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Theresa start and talk about the clinician perspective from OSU.
Thanks, Tina. So as I mentioned, my full-time job is in the outpatient assistive technology center, but I have had the luxury of being involved on the academic side, but I kind of dipped into it. So Carmen has really been my mentor in looking to make sure like teaching skills and I'm meeting the rigorous needs. We've always taught a course on assistive technology to the OTs, which is the OT 7411 that you see there. Whoops, one more second, Tina. But the RITC is a completely online course that I'll talk about. And then I want to talk about how in the clinic we adopted some of these principles with our grand rounds and product and services. Now you can switch for me. So with yes, thank you. So as I said, historically, the course was a traditional classroom course with labs. I would leave the medical center, go over to the university and just have a traditional classroom setting. But during the pandemic, we had this shift and everything had to be recorded or we had to do it via Zoom. We chose not to do a 2-hour Zoom class because we thought, oh my God, nobody's gonna stay awake. So we decided to pre-record the lectures and use the live time for that, what he calls synchronous learning. And I think that feedback mechanism is the key piece of keeping people engaged. We weren't really sure how it was gonna go. And what we realized is that we finally accomplished a hurdle that we had always struggled with getting interaction from the students. So post-pandemic, we ended up with a blended model, keeping some of the online components, but being back in the classroom in front of people. So the next slide kind of goes through how we broke it out. As I said, in the pandemic, we pre-recorded all the lectures and we asked them to listen to it prior to the synchronous time, which means I don't want you to watch it an hour ahead of time. I want you to use, we open it a week ahead of time. Use the next week to watch these watch these lectures. And what we found is it gave them time to think about it, to process it. They had readings and they had some homework that they had to do. But the fact that we separated the lectures from the discussions gave them time to process the information in a way we always struggled with when we had that 2-hour block. We couldn't do any labs because of just the on-site. I mean, we weren't allowed to be on-site. So we knew that we were losing something with the equipment trials. So we added some discussion posts. We added some different type of strategies to allow them to have that feedback and have that interaction that they couldn't have face-to-face. And like I said, we had weekly sessions where we just met in real time with them. And it was kind of nice for me because I didn't have to cart across campus. I could stay at the medical center. So when we went to the post-pandemic model, I started thinking, wow, we had so much interaction. How can we keep that? So I presented it to the students and I said, we can have the opportunity to either meet here for 2 hours, or I could post the lectures and you would watch them prior to coming into class, knowing that not the hour before. And then we would have that time more with the interaction. In every single one of them, I had nobody oppose me. They wanted to keep with that model. So it helped for me as far as my efficiency because it didn't pull me out of the clinic more. But of course, I did the lectures and I recorded them in off hours, but it gave me more time for that intense discussion. We did maintain the discussion posts. And then with the labs, because I couldn't come on site, we couldn't come to the medical center, I reached out to my vendors and I asked what they were able to do, what their setting was like. And both of my vendors welcomed us with open arms and they had more space and they had really more, the environment was more indicative of what we really needed to accomplish. So we maintained all of our social distancing, all of our guidelines. And what I realized, it gave them that opportunity to meet the team. So even though I didn't get them to come to my clinic, it was more important for them to meet the team that they're going to work with out into the community. So the post-pandemic, we really learned from the pandemic and had what I call a blended model. So the next slide. There's one back, Tina. Yeah. So the participation and interaction is really what it took the pandemic to show us how to really change things to a unique model. We've always struggled with how can we get more interaction. We don't want to just stand up and talk to the students, but they didn't have the information, so they couldn't process it and talk to us unless they had the information ahead of time. As I said, the interaction in shifting the labs to a setting that was more conducive really gained that partnership with the CRT suppliers and allowed that to occur. And it really gave us that multifaceted approach combining in-person and online programs. Next slide. The certificate program has always been and will always be 100% online. It has a rolling admission. It's very self-directed. And in preparing for this, one thing that Ann will talk about is when the learners can learn at their own pace. And so it's very good for the adult learner, for people that are, maybe coming back into a next career. But what I struggle with is that sense of community. I mean, this online format, I can't see y'all, I can't see your smiles, but we have to figure out that feedback mechanism that Carmen talked about. And so that's the piece that we have to do better at when we're going to do a completely online program. Next slide. So into the medical center. Well, what can we do? Because we couldn't have people come on site. We couldn't be in a room together. We had to all be 6 feet apart. So we decided to do our grand rounds virtual. And my colleague Wendy is the amazing coordinator of this. And what we use Teams on the medical center side. So what we realized is we started gaining a wider audience. Even though we weren't together in one room, by us being virtual, we were able to be at the same grand rounds as inpatient and outpatient because they're in a different building. And then we gained colleagues that were outside of Columbus. And then we gained manufacturers, we gained suppliers. We found that our bandwidth grew and we were reaching more people. Now that in certain times, like we were allowed to be together, now we're not allowed to be together, but we also felt that sense of community we were missing because I would be in my office, Matt would be in his office. We were all kind of scattered around the building. So when the environment allowed us, we still are in one room, but then we have it like we're hosting it virtual. And so what that does is bring kind of our community. And even though we know that we're interacting, we still are able to reach people outside of the medical center. So the next slide talks about the manufacturing and services. Well, how do you do a manufacturing and service when the whole purpose of it is to be together and to touch equipment? So obviously before the pandemic, we had our manufacturers come to the outpatient site, go to the inpatient site, and we would have hands-on. But we realized we couldn't do that and we didn't want to lose that interaction with our manufacturers. So we asked them if they were comfortable doing it, via Teams, and they adopted it very well. And what we learned from that is we now can tap into the experts that were outside of clinic that would not have had to travel in to be in person. So it became the manufacturers tapping into resources that they had that could then zoom in and then had the manufacturers that we knew every day, our reps, kind of present. So same thing with the after is that we continue to have these. And then we have the manufacturer go around and do individual hands-on, kind of like what we're doing in the exhibit hall for this session, is we're getting information about best products, and then we're following up one-to-one when we already have a frame of reference. And hopefully, like the academic model, we'll have time to process and ask more questions so that when we are face-to-face, it's a better use of our time. And I think that is the end of my section. Yes, I'm going to pass it to Ann.
Thanks, Theresa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the supplier perspective. So if we'll go to that first slide. Really what we had to look, it's no secret the CRT supplier industry is aging. And so is that we need to bring in new ATPs. And so we're hiring a lot of new people who have to step in the shoes of ATPs who have been in the field a long time. We have a lot of tribal knowledge. So we realized we had a couple of goals we had to do. One was first we have to get them certified through the resin exam. So they've got to get through that material, that structure, and pass the exam. But that didn't mean that they were really ready to go in the field and be truly competent, proficient ATPs. So we also needed, a curriculum and a program that allowed them to build all the areas that an ATP needs to know. I mean, there's clinical knowledge, there's equipment knowledge, payer knowledge, people have to have some business acumen. They have to know the ecosystems of their system, how to work their computers and their laptops. So there's a lot of training and education that kind of happens from day one. And we have just sort of started this before the pandemic. So we knew what our goals were. We were hiring a lot of new people, but then we had some challenges we had to look at. So with hiring a lot of new people coming from all different backgrounds, we also had 4 time zones to address. So you couldn't have just one course because somebody would either be at 4 in the morning or 8 at night. So we had time zones to look at, and we also had a variety of educational levels. We have folks with high school or GED achievements, but they have years of hands-on experience, as well as we had folks with lots of secondary degrees with maybe little to no hands-on experience and exposure. But everyone is still needing to kind of know the same thing. How they learn, how they ramp, kind of depends on their background. We have folks with all different kinds of learning capabilities. I would say we have a high percentage of kinesthetic learners. They learn by touching, and they're auditory learners. They learn by hearing. They're not necessarily good at reading a textbook, assimilating that material, learning it, and passing it on. So we had to look at all those different things with them. We also have learners that are full-time employed. They're working, a lot more than a 40-hour work week. They are single, they're married, they have children and grandchildren, they're caretakers of parents. So we also had an environment of, they weren't in an academic setting. It's not like, okay, everybody, you'll be at school at 9 o'clock on Monday. You're going to do this course, study, take this exam, and we're going to move to the next course. So we really had to look at that time challenge. How would we roll things out so that it was effective? They were learning things and passing them on. We always talk about, in what we're doing with it, where I work, is it's not about making a grade. It's not about making an A or completing this course, whatever. We're really after you learning it, implementing it, integrating it into your practicing, being able to apply it. The other part of looking this whole big education online, why are we doing it? Who was it? And how are we going to approach it? Is kind of some capacity limitations. While education is supported and loved, it's usually not a big department. It usually doesn't have a great big, budget. So there were limited staff with a big lift, but we all kind of pulled together, and administrative records. So we manually were doing all this. We created this program. It was being emailed out manually every week. We had those different kinds of things. We reviewed things on hand. So it became a capacity issue of, when you have 5 students, it's one thing, that when you have 10, when you have 15, when you have 20, and they're all overlapping at different parts within the program, depending on what module they've tackled and accomplished, it really became an issue. We had to look at this learning management system. We needed to figure out some way to be able to be better at what we do. As well as we also had a need, we also have education for outside of the supplier world, doing CEUs and CEUs for our clinical partners. And as Tina talked about, there is a lot of auditing of people, how long they're in a course, then you have to issue CEUs, and that was all done by hand. That really became quite a capacity issue for us. And so we'd been talking and looking at learning management systems, but it really wasn't top on anybody's priority because they can be an expensive system. The other part of this was capacity, is we were bringing people into a central location for training to give them kind of that hands-on experience to be able to put it all together. And there's some obvious things about that. That can be very costly because you're bringing people from all over the country. You're taking them out of the field, away from their daily activities and responsibilities, away for their family, as well as that administrative burden of somebody's got to schedule airfares and transportation and hotels, et cetera. So we felt like we had come up with a program. We knew we needed to do it more efficiently. And so I had reached out to Carmen, who had given me lots of great ideas, as online was just becoming a thing. So I wanted to first kind of level set with where you were and what we were doing and all the kind of things that need to come into play when you look at this. So next slide.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, there we go.
So before COVID, we ended up with an augmented self-study program. So we created courses over a 14-week period. One of the challenge we had was we also, because we were beginning and that whole accountability and testing stuff. And if someone, oh, I didn't quite get it done this week because you're not in a classroom, it's not a set start and stop date. We sometimes struggled with people kind of surfing through school. So we had this program that was put in place, but it was a good start. And as I said earlier, it was manually delivered. So every week we had to roll out to an email group of here's your lesson for this week. Within that approach, we had reading assignments. They had a pre-recorded webinar if it was appropriate to the material they were studying, which was good. It gave them kind of a different modality. And then I started with a weekly assignment called a BOGO. So there was a written assignment where they would integrate their material and try to apply it, or as I used to say, connect the dots to what they were trying to learn. Because again, we were trying to do this online. We were approaching all different levels of people and trying to make this material real for them. So we had the traditional classroom experience when we brought people in-house, when we brought them to a central location where we could give them that hands-on experience that creates that critical thinking that's so important, I think, when we do evaluations, when we work in this complex rehab field where there's a lot of problem solving that's needed. It's not a matter of we can flip the page and say, here's the diagnosis, here's the age, weight, height, etc. This is what you do. There's so much that comes into it. So we would bring people in. We did this by small groups where there would be a case study. They would have things they would have to problem solve and present to the group. So we really tried to figure out how we could augment this online course with this hands-on reel to fit it into their week and to get it together. As we moved down the track, and as some of our hires came from clinical backgrounds, we realized that they were able to get to the material faster. They had more of that clinical background, so we didn't have to build that on top of everything else. And so then we had an accelerated version of this 14-week kind of structured program. So we thought we were kind of rocking along. We are evolving. One of the things we always do is look at and evaluate. The sense of community that Theresa talked about, I thought was super important. I mean, we couldn't require another blog time, another post time. I mean, folks are already working 40 plus hours a week and trying to get home and have some family life. So our company went to workplace. So we created workplace groups within the study sessions. They were private groups, meaning that not anybody could jump in. You had to be a member of that workplace group to give that session of people an opportunity to say, hey, I'm working on this. Do you have a problem? Are you confused? Whatever. And we found that kind of successful in the beginning, but as we began to evolve into this screen time that we live and breathe in from the minute we get up till we go to bed, there was some screen fatigue. There was we had less involvement as we went on. Well, then all of a sudden, as we all know, those of us who have been in complex rehab for any period of time knows that change is the name of the game. So all of a sudden, COVID. So now we are forced into trying to pivot because we still had new hires that needed all of this education and training. We weren't allowed to do anything in person. We couldn't train anywhere, but we still had the same goals, the same challenges. So if there's a semblance of a silver lining of COVID, I think for us is that it accelerated the learning management system that we looked for and found. Because through a better system, we were able to load all of our content. We could break it up into smaller courses and modules. There was less manual manipulation of the material. We could track it. We have on-time, real-time tracking. We can tell how long you've been in a course, how much time you spent in it, have you completed it? So we were able to do a little better monitoring than this to say, have you turned in your assignment this week? Or let me go look in the email box and see if it's there. So for us, that was kind of one of our silver linings. The hands-on centralized training we did was replaced by what we call branch level exercises, where we would have a case study. We would send it out to subject matter experts in the field so that there was, here's your case study, here's what you should measure that somebody, apply the situation, spec out a chair, fit it, deliver it, train on it, program the electronics, all the things that we really want ATPs to do well and to learn. The problem was it's accountability, it's time, it's squeezing in another thing. We did post-COVID though, learn from that. We learned how to make it more concise. We have instructor guides, we have student guides. And I think we've, as we're still working and evolving through that process. We also then pivoted, we had sort of with teams. So we all function on teams. And instead of doing kind of the workplace group to get our community, we went to an open desk, which in college land, I guess, would be like an open office. So once a week for 30 minutes, there's an open desk where all of the developmental candidates can jump in and out as needed and pretty much ask any question they can ask of each other. We kind of use resources. If someone has graduated, passed their exam, and they can give advice to folks that are getting ready to test, have things to help them get through it. So we feel like we've gotten better and we've moved through some of those things. And we think our administration is more concise, reportable, and it's more transparent and clear for everyone in the program. Next slide. So I really thought this was great that, teaching doesn't get better by chance. You can't just think, oh, there's going to be a new textbook or there's going to be a new program or a new webinar, but it really does get better by change. And I think COVID has accelerated. I hate to use the force, but it kind of did force us to jump in to think about how can we reach more people? How can we reach them on how they learn in the timeframes they have to learn, so that they don't, not only do they not just learn it, because we want them to learn the material, they have to pass an exam, but we really want them to be able to apply what they've learned to what they do on a day-to-day basis and to be able to implement it into their practice. We want ATPs who are proficient, who are competent and confident, so that the equipment and the outcomes, the clinical partners they work with, they can have a very productive team because they're using each other's resources and strengths. The clinician, we hope, gives us the information about the body, and the supplier brings in the information and all of the things about the equipment. We match the goals that's evaluated in the MAT assessment together, and hopefully our outcomes are even better because of that. So I think that change has really made a difference for us. So as our outcomes, as I've kind of said, we have better instructional material because of this. When we went to learning management system and putting all of our content now online, we looked at trying to make them more interactive. So we have anatomy of models, which for the clinicians, this may be old hat for you, but for us, it was pretty cool, which they have an anatomy figure that they could touch the screen and rotate and turn it upside down and see what a hip obliquity really looks like, because you can read it and see it in a static figure. But when you see it dynamically move on a screen, you're like, oh, now I get what they're talking about. So I think we have better material. We have software now, so instead of death by PowerPoint, where it's just slide after slide, sorry about things like this, but you could actually touch the screen. We have interactive quizzes, things that you move around. So it's a little bit more of small task, testing and low risk testing. And it's different modalities because we know people learn all different ways. The other thing we've really incorporated this year is like one of the main textbooks for the resident exam. We always tell people how to have it read to you, turn text to speech on a simple Kindle, so that if you learn auditorily, you can't read through all those pages. You learn by reading through, hearing as you're driving down the road to your next eval. We still struggle with, we've got ease of administration and monitoring. I will tell you that has been just a godsend as far as CEU certificates, et cetera, comes into play. And again, as we've talked about, the program is upon demand. So if you are home at 9 o'clock at night and you have an hour, you can put in an hour. What we're trying to get away from is that everybody crams on a weekend, because if you cram a lot of material in one setting, we know you don't retain it. You don't really learn it. You may be able to pass a quiz or check a box, but are you able to apply and implement it? And that to me is a really important factor of our program. I will say, though, we can teach the process, we can do all the things, we can teach the words and the philosophy, but it's the integration and application of that knowledge, the critical thinking and the problem solving that comes from using our eyes to observe our clients as they're sitting and they're rolling into clinic, our hands to feel. There's nothing like when you're working with someone on the mat and you put your hands and you go, this is where the lateral supports need to be, or you're moving and changing different seat to back or angles or range of motion, you feel that relaxation. You cannot replace that with a slide or online education. Or using your ears to listen. Is someone making sounds? Are they using this sigh of this whole, I'm very comfortable now? Those things we can't replace with online. So I think we're still struggling with how in today's world where getting together is limited, touching, hands-on is limited, that we're still trying to figure out how to integrate that part of the learning process for our new ATPs. But I believe that all of this has brought us to a better place, and I think we're better educators because of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tina.
Thank you, Anne. And I'm going to give you more of the perspective from the business perspective at our company that I was at when the pandemic started. And I know one of my former employees is on the webinar as well, so she can relate to this. What happened at the onset of COVID is it really forced a dramatic shift. So I was actually living in Europe. And my team was spread all over the US. We had a team of 4 educators and one person who was just returning after a year of maternity leave back into the education side. So it was pretty stressful anyway. We were already doing things at a distance within our team, but we definitely were doing all of our education face-to-face and working towards how do we do better face-to-face? How do we do better seminar CEUs and things like that? So on very short notice, I always tell the story about in February of 2000, I'm going to get the year wrong because it all seems so long ago, 2019 ISS, right, was in Vancouver. I was getting ready to get on a plane the next morning and my office called and said, this COVID thing is in Italy. You need to stay home. So all of a sudden, we were supposed to have a big meeting at ISS. All of a sudden, everybody's world changed, right? So some of the things that we weren't ready for, we had been discussing going to online education and to doing on-demand or live webinar programs. And we'd been investigating different platforms and how we would do that. And really, our capacity was pretty limited as far as administrative support. And we were just kind of starting to look at the programs. We had a good idea, but we really had to look at the platforms, whether it was Zoom, GoToWebinar, Teams, because we had to consider who was going to be attending those and how easy was it? What was the limitation to those platforms? How did the programs need to change to accommodate to online learning? You know, things like we've mentioned before, like surveys and tests, pre and post tests, things like that that could be integrated into the programs. And how would we target attendees? We knew people were demanding education and wanted to continue that, especially once COVID hit and people were at home. But it was really hard to know how we could target them and get them to understand where our programs were and how to access them. From an administration side, I know Anne talked about it and Theresa, the documentation for CEUs was one of our biggest challenges because we were doing it all by hand. You know, when you're at a lecture, people fill out their forms and then we would take it back and someone would transcribe it into Excel and then we'd send it to, you know, our CEU provider and we would keep a copy, you know, electronically. We needed to find out a way to make that happen automatically. Now, I am not the best at technology all the time. Christy, who is on this, also will say that she didn't know how to do this either. We had one person on our team who was great with technology. She could edit videos, and she worked with the marketing department to find a way that through a back door, when you get those emails that say, click here, fill out your survey and get your certificate, it's not that easy. And that was something I wasn't prepared for because it looks really easy, right? When you click on that link or that QR code and everything pops up. We had to have them take a survey, take a test, and then it had to be smart enough that if you scored a certain amount on the test, it then automatically generated a certificate with the correct information from that particular live webinar. So when you start thinking about all the steps, like in my head, that sounded simple until we had to try to implement that and figure out a way to do that online. There are learning management systems that can do that easily. There's other ones where you can do part of that. So you have to find out a way how to integrate that all into one. So how could we auto-generate that as well? Because we couldn't be printing off spreadsheets and emailing each person individually. We also had people challenges. None of us had really done a lot of online presenting before. So we had to all learn a new style of presenting and kind of change the way we approached it. And I think the biggest challenge, I think you guys would agree, is the lack of feedback. Like I can't see any of you. I know there are 58 participants signed up right now, but I see no one except for Theresa and Anne. So sometimes it's really hard to gauge, and it's a different way of presenting because you don't get that feedback. Just like you're not getting the same feedback, we're not getting it either. And that really changes the way you present and changes how you can do things. So I think those were some of the biggest challenges that we had. So some of the outcomes, I think the outcomes were pretty good actually. So we picked a webinar platform. We picked GoToWebinar. I was at Motion Composites at the time. We looked at things like Zoom. Right now, I think all of us use various platforms, right? Sometimes I use Zoom, sometimes I use Teams, sometimes I use WhatsApp, sometimes we just use FaceTime, depending on who we're talking to or what we're doing. So there's so many things. What we weren't prepared for, the outcome was good, was our first webinar. We did not limit the number of attendees or registrants. We had 750 registrants for our first 1 hour webinar online. Now, that's a good thing, but the capacity of our program was only 500. And we know that's changed significantly as the pandemic has worn on, and people have a little bit, I think, of online webinar fatigue, and they've gone back to work. But the administrative part of that was daunting to us because we hadn't, got it all tied down at that point. So it really forced us to push that faster. I think as a result, all the administrative tasks and the parts that come with it have become much more efficient and much easier to do. And I think all of us, for the most part, have learned to embrace our video cameras a little bit more. I will say that pre-pandemic, I dreaded when I had a company meeting or a meeting with clients that was just online and I had to be on video. I'm not sure why. It was okay if it was face-to-face, but I think we've all kind of learned to embrace it a little bit more. And it is a nice substitute. It's not a perfect substitute for face-to-face, but it does give you some interaction. You can see people interacting. The screenshot on here that I have is a Zoom webinar that we did in New Zealand. And at the end, I finally asked everybody, can you guys turn on your cameras? A few people had them on during, but it's really nice to kind of see that, and you kind of can gain that sense of community by seeing each other at least. I would say that this isn't going away. From the manufacturer side, a lot of manufacturers have shifted to live webinars, on-demand webinars, which is asynchronous, and you don't have the same feedback. And I think we continue to draw people, but also a more diverse group of people, ATPs and clinicians. So I know that when I reviewed some of the webinar stuff that we've done over the last 2 years, we've touched all time zones in the US and Canada, as well as people from over 20 other countries. So you wouldn't get that in a regular course. And it's really nice to get the feedback from all of those different people in those diverse groups to kind of figure out the best way to take your education plans and how it can be more encompassing for everybody. Because even in the United States, someone who's a therapist on the West Coast does things differently than someone on the East Coast or in the Midwest. So it's interesting to get the feedback from all of those different people. And also there are some times when you can have interaction on those programs as well. So I think the outcomes are fairly positive, even though at the time it felt really rushed and it was very nerve-wracking. As I said, we were trying to prepare to go to this, but the pandemic forced us to make that leap much, much faster. I would say in about a 4-week period, we switched from having no platform and no online presence to having everything online. So it was quite the task. And there was a huge team of people that helped us get there. So that's kind of the end of our presentation, but I did want to kind of sum some things up before we open up to questions. So I really think that it really points to the fact the pandemic has made us look at a lot of things, right? And like I said, this presentation was suggested long before the pandemic. So it's just kind of ironic that this is when we finally got to present it. We need to stay technology driven. because it will determine our future success. I've learned that I have to be more technology driven. I think, Anne, you would agree the same way. Theresa, we've all got a little bit better. There's still always quirks and things that we can't do. You have to be flexible how you teach, and you also have to be flexible how you learn, because you never know when those circumstances might change, right? Like I said, this isn't going away. I think it's here to stay. Also understanding that online education, while you miss some of the in-person things, it can really broaden your opportunities and your opportunities to reach a more diverse audience, to really get a sense of community with people who maybe don't do things exactly like you do, which can be a really good thing, especially in our field, because it opens our mind to more innovation, to better ideas on how to do things differently. But then I will also second Anne's thing, is that you do have to understand that sometimes in-person learning can't really be substituted for. So I don't think that in my lifetime we'll see a time when all education, especially in our field, is only online or only via webinar or only self-directed. I think there's always going to be that place where sometimes in-person learning, like the hands-on part, really can't be completely substituted. Do you guys have anything to add to that, Anne or Theresa?
Maybe when the hologram comes in and the client is in your office, then we might be able to get away from
Yeah, there you go.
totally online.
Perfect. And we all would like to thank our employers as well for supporting us throughout this presentation: Ohio State, New Motion, and Body Point. And with that, this is all of our contact information. If you need to get a hold of us, these are all of our emails. I believe, Theresa, you uploaded a copy of the presentation as well, so it'll
Yes,
be on that.
presentation should be in the portal under handouts. I don't see any questions.
Nope.
I did put the code in the chat. Are there any other questions? And if not, I can just read the code to you. Did you pick a particular LMS platform?
You know, at Motion Composites, we just chose GoToWebinar because it was fast and relatively easy, but it doesn't integrate with the system completely. But it was a nice platform and easy to use.
And we chose Academy of Mind because it gave us the whole CEU, CEC thing. And the more we use it, the more we learn how to use it. And I think the more we ask, like, well, can it do this? I think they also are expanding and growing their program. So that's just what worked with us. Historically, our company training was on a company called Greenlight. And we knew that was not going to be the learning management system for us because it had a lot more HR things attached to it. And we really needed more of that educational CEU aspect of it. So that's one we went with.
Thank you. There's a next question. What are the best ways to get participation from learners? Assignments, case studies, discussion boards? I'm going to initially answer it because that's something we really struggled with. So I think when you're in the live environment, to get that participation, polls, they're not that easy for me to develop, but the polls gives them that direct feedback. So I'll pose a question, let everybody answer it. Anytime they can answer it without feeling like they're on the spot is better. And then they can see how they answered compared to everyone else. And then we have discussion on why the other answers were not correct, why it was the best answer. I've had the best live interaction that way. The chat feature actually gets a lot more interaction than I thought it would. So when we were all online and we weren't in a classroom setting, I found the chat that people were thinking more than they were actually saying, but they felt safe putting it in the chat. And so I think the polls helps people feel safe.
I agree with Theresa. Yeah, no, I agree with Theresa. I will say that one of the things it makes you do from a teaching standpoint, for those guys who are thinking about doing more online education, is you do have to learn to multitask, to be able to pay attention to what you're saying, what's on the screen, the polls, and the chat sometimes at the same time. So it can be a challenge.
Yeah.
I too think the case studies was a good way. I mean, in person, for us, we had sort of a safe space. And so I could pull information, or if someone wasn't speaking, I can do it, but I do the same thing online. So if I'm sitting there and someone over here in the box isn't saying a word, I can say, so Tina, you haven't really jumped in too much. Tell us how you feel, or what do you think, or what are your questions that you don't understand this? So I think we do the same thing. It's just in a different platform with a different modality, but you do have to be aware of your, the audience of your students and where they are and who is kind of taking over and owning and who you need to bring in.
Great. Okay, well, let's go ahead. Lots of thank yous, good jobs. Thank you very much. I think Carmen did a great job. Kudos to him for using technology. And I wish his family well in their recovery. The code is A as in Apple, 0, G as in goat, N as in Nancy, L as in Libra, and H as in happy. So A0GNLH.
Thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak to you.
Yeah, thank you.